and August as a vacation. And then we will be back with you in September for a fall sequence of programs. Let me remind you to keep yourselves on mute while the speaker is talking. If you are thinking that you are just going to lose the track of the question you really want to ask, please put it in the chat. And Mary and I will both watch the chat and try to make sure we get back to you and your question at the end of the presentation. I also want to thank the people who make this possible behind the scenes. Magine Daniels and Karen Stuck for the publicity without which you wouldn't know anything about this. Judy Berman, of course, who makes the village run, and Mary Bloodworth, who is our tech person and makes sure that we can all hear each other and see each other. So with that, I want to encourage you all to enjoy the last program of our season. Our speaker tonight is Kevin Mallinson. He was recommended to me after he spoke at a memoirs section for the village. And when I looked at his background, I thought, this is a really extraordinary person. A firefighter in Key West, who became a nurse, who was a Fulbrighter in Swaziland in South Africa, Southern Africa, not South Africa. And finally, a professor of nursing at George Mason. So with all that, we should have an interesting evening with someone who has been in some different careers with different perspectives. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Trudy. Let me pull up my slides here. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the issues around my being a firefighter in Key West and being America's first openly gay professional firefighter and why that turned out to be an issue, whether I wanted it to be or not. And then what I'm looking forward to most are questions and discussion amongst all of us. So let me start by saying that if you don't know where Key West is, for those of you who've never been there, it's 150 miles south of Miami. And in order to get there, if you're going by car, you would go over US 1, or what we call the overseas highway. You would jump over bridges from island to island until you get to the very last island, which is Key West. And it is worth the trip, because once you get there, you're going to find beautiful homes, beautiful gardens, a small island with a lot of interesting people in it. And the homes are called conch houses after the locals. The locals are called conchs, named after the, of course, mollusk that's found in the Caribbean waters. But like a lot of other gay men and lesbians, in the 1970s, I moved down to Key West. I was drawn there for this beautiful island paradise, but I was also drawn there because I had a boyfriend named Joe. So Joe and I had met in 1977, and 6 months later, I moved down to Key West to be with him. And in those days, I was young, I was strong, I was 25 years old, and I was a long distance runner. So I was out running generally 10 miles a day. So in pretty good shape. Joe and I had bought a piece of land about 15 miles north of Key West, a little area called the Saddle Bunch Keys. So this was the view out from the piece of land that we had looking over the mangroves. And this is where we started building our home. And indeed, we were the ones building the structure. I mean, from the pilings and the floor beams to the roof rafters, and then finally to the walls and windows and doors, we did all of it. It's the proverbial sweat equity that you put in to own your own first house. And, you know, we were really optimistic about our future. It was a wonderful time, but admittedly, there were really tough realities in life as being gay men. And it's important to recognize when I talk about my story that it took place at a specific point in time, right? So I joined the fire department 42 years ago in 1981. In the late 1970s, you all remember, Jerry Falwell had recently established the moral majority movement, using his religious fundamentalism to stir up fear and distrust and hate among evangelical Christians in the country. And one of his main targets was the so-called gay rights movement. After Miami-Dade County passed a law that outlawed discrimination against gay men and lesbians, Anita Bryant started her Save the Children campaign, in which she pretty much labeled gay men as child molesters and admonished lesbians for just being women who hated men. She succeeded in convincing the voters of Miami-Dade to reverse the law and once again make it legal to fire somebody because of their sexual orientation. What this led to at the time was a national wave of homophobia and stereotyping of gay men and lesbians, stigmatization, discrimination, and eventually gay bashing, which is violence against gay men and lesbians. Now, my partner Joe and I were so angry that our community had been targeted, and now was the target of violence, that we partnered with several other people to create a gay and lesbian speakers bureau. We went to the local college and we were invited into classes on psychology, sociology, human sexuality. And the idea was to tell our story, just who we were and what we did in the community, and then answer questions about homosexuality because people had some really outrageous ideas. Eventually, we were invited to speak to every class of police recruits at the college. And that was great because these trainees were the ones who were going to be out on the streets of Key West as police officers in another 6 months. So we really were aiming to debunk the myths and to establish really better relationships between police officers and the public. Sounds like today, doesn't it? But it was in this context that I went and applied for a job to be a professional firefighter with the Key West Fire Department in 1981. And as you might imagine, not only was firefighting pretty much a male profession at this time, it was always touted as a red-blooded male, American male profession, whatever that meant. But what I did know right from the beginning is that gay men were not going to be welcome. But the chief interviewed me, put me through a physical agility and strength evaluation, along with 2 other guys that were up for hire as well. And all 3 of us passed. So he hired me, John, and Johnny. John and Johnny were both local conks who had relatives in the fire department, born and raised on the island. I was the outsider who was not born and raised there and had no relatives. But I was 25 years old. And what I do in my book is I really talk a lot about some of the unique aspects of the fire service that makes it particularly hard for gay men to be open about their sexual orientation. So right from the very beginning, I would say I wasn't the only man in that department that had relationships with other men. I was the only one who was not married to a woman and had children. I was the only one who was open about who I was. And I was a professional firefighter. And what I mean by that is I wasn't a volunteer who did this occasionally on and off. It was a full-time job, great benefits, and we would work 24-hour shifts. So when I went in for a day of work, I was there for 24 hours, 7 in the morning till 7 in the morning. And professional firefighters eat all their meals together. And in these days, in fire station number 1, where I was placed, we all slept in a common bunk room. So it was a big room in which 5 or 6 guys would all be sleeping and some would be snoring. But you know, I was really proud to be serving my community. Once I put on that uniform and the badge, or wore the turnout gear that we wore to fire scenes, it really told me that firefighters have a covenant with their community. I mean, we're there to protect your lives and your property, even at the risk of our own life. Unfortunately, from my very first day in the job, I was harassed by the firemen, mostly the conks, the locals, as the faggot, the pansy, the queer. I was an outsider who they felt was not welcome in their fire department. And I had to keep making it clear that I was a member of that community, and so it was also my fire department. There were about 50 men working across 3 fire stations in the city. And as I said, we worked 24 hours on, and then we had 48 hours off. The chief had assigned me to a shift, a watch, as we called it, of misfits who were so disagreeable, so bitter, and so mean-spirited. And it was really difficult to consider them professionals. But the men on my watch were really determined to force me out of the department from day one. So I was harassed and mistreated my first 24-hour shift, and they were convinced I would never come back again. But 2 days later, I showed up for my second shift. Now, it would be easy to say, sticks and stones and that names will never hurt me, but names actually are damaging, but so are sticks and stones. These homophobic firemen openly threaten me on a regular basis, push me up against walls, tell me that they were going to beat me up. And on any particular day, I always felt that I was going to be attacked at any one time. Their discomfort, I was trying to understand what is so wrong with them. I'm here as a firefighter. I can pick up the hose, I can run, I can do all the things anybody else can do, at least as a brand new firefighter, I could. And yet they felt I didn't belong there simply because I went home to a man at night as opposed to a wife. So there was a guy in the department I thought was going to be helpful, and that was Oscar McIntosh, because Oscar was the first paid Black firefighter in the department, and I figured he must have had a hard time. There was certainly plenty of racism. And I thought, well, maybe he would kind of understand the situation that I was in. And he'd been there 15 years. And what I found out is that he had been harassed and mistreated for all 15 years that he had been there, had never been made to feel welcome. So consequently, he was every bit as confrontative and mean as the other guys. My response, though, is in response to their being mean or taunting me or making fun of me in any number of ways. I never wanted to disrespect them. So I didn't call them names. I didn't point out all their deficiencies, and they had plenty. I didn't make fun of them in a way that would disrespect them, because I certainly didn't yell back at them or threaten violence to them, because that wasn't going to get me anywhere. I weighed 130 pounds, and men like Oscar weighed 230 pounds. So I certainly wasn't going to win anything by belittling them or threatening them. But I did use my sense of humor and my wit to constantly throw them off balance. And I talk a lot about that in the book, but my humor was usually self-deprecating humor. And it really bought me a lot of points with the good men in the department, because I did run across firefighters in the department who didn't really care if I was gay. All they wanted to know was, can you fight a fire? And will you have my back when we go into these situations that are so dangerous? So one day, as I was coming up on 6 months of being in the department, I got called into the chief's office, and next to the chief was Oscar. He had gone to the chief and accused me of sexual harassment and inappropriate touching. Me, a 130-pound guy, inappropriately touching a 230-pound guy. But the chief knew me well enough to know that I had not lied about anything since the day that I got there, and he certainly knew Oscar. So after Oscar made his case, I turned to the chief and I said, "Do you believe any of that?" And the chief said, "No, not a bit of it." So he told Oscar to get lost. And what he clearly explained to me was at 6 months is where I become a permanent employee of the city. And they wanted to make sure that I was kicked out before that 6 months happened. And I said, yeah, I can understand that. I said, I understand they're, wanting me to leave the department. I said, but I'm not going anywhere. And the chief looked at me and said, well, I could fire you right now because there was no law that protected a gay man in his job. And I said, yes, chief, you could fire me right now. And I would go right to a lawyer and I'd take you to court and I'd take the city to court. And the chief looked at me and smiled and he said, I believe you would do that. He says, I'm not going to fire you, but just keep your head down and get to what you need to do because you still have to go to fire college. Well, that was the big wall sitting in front of me. It was all three of us that had been hired. We're learning all the basics about firefighting, but we had to be certified by the state of Florida in order to be able to keep our jobs long term. So that meant traveling from Key West up to Ocala, Florida, in the middle of the state for 6 weeks for what we call fire college. Well, many of you have probably seen these fire training academies all around. We certainly have them here in DC down by Blue Plains. And this was a 6-week training session in which recruits came from all over the state to be certified. There were 33 of us that showed up from different cities around the state. 3 of us came from Key West, me, John, and Johnny, the other 2 guys that I've been hired with. Now, they told us right at day 1 that this is 6 weeks long, but that half of you will be failing out before we ever get to the end of the 6 weeks. And so they terrify you and make it as if you can't possibly pass this. Well, in truth, over the next 6 weeks, 19 failed out and there were only 14 of us left. So John and Johnny, the 2 guys that I had gone up with, the local Key West guys, both failed out the first week and they were sent back home. I stayed for the whole 6 weeks and I graduated first in the class that year for the fire college. So coming back to Key West, I thought, great, things are going to change now. I have a letter from the state fire marshal saying Key West had the #1 firefighter at fire college this year, and I'd proven myself capable. Let's just see if that actually is what happened. Well, achieving certification boosted my confidence. I really felt now that I had the ability to fight fires. I knew how to stay safe. I knew how to help my fellow firefighters in a bad scene. But it really didn't significantly alter the attitudes of those men who wanted me to quit. So on a daily basis, I was still subjected to taunts and threats of violence. But then things began to get worse. Not only were they pushing me up against the wall and threatening to beat me to a pulp, they were now saying that when we get to a fire, we won't have your back. You might get injured in a fire, which is probably one of the worst things a firefighter can say to somebody on their team. I think one of the things that bothered me the most of the time is that my captain or any of the administration that I dealt with never interceded with all of these taunts and physical assaults. They heard the men say, we won't protect you when we get to a fire, and never was there any punishment or any kind of note put in their personnel record that they had said things like this. So it's not to say that I didn't, though, have support from some of the firefighters. We went to big fires, and this is me fighting a major fire out at the college, our community college. And by fighting fires and being brave and running in and doing things I needed to do and doing them well, because I had learned in fire college, I was beginning to grow on the good guys in the department who were beginning to believe that even though they didn't work with me on a regular basis, I was probably not as bad as everyone was making me out to be. So one day, this man, Al Raming, who was the second Black firefighter ever hired into the department, came over to our shift to work because one of our lieutenants was sick. So we needed another lieutenant to take his place for the day. So when Al walked in, I'd never met him before. He immediately walked right up to me, put his hand out and said, "You must be Kevin. It's a pleasure to meet you." Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather because this was the first guy who actually approached me in a supportive, friendly way. Well, immediately the men that I worked with jumped on him for it and said, "Oh, so you like faggots, huh? So you like faggots." And he turned to them and snapped back at them and said, "Yeah, a lot of them are my friends." I realized right then and there that Al didn't like these guys that were taunting me. So a few minutes later, he comes over and sits down with me with a cup of coffee. And he says, "You know, Kevin, you have as much right to be here as any of these guys do. In fact, you probably have more of a right than some of them." So Al became a great pal. On my days off, Joe and I continued to build our house. My partner, Joe, was a construction manager for the cable company. So he was the supervisor in charge of placing poles, running wires, concrete work, all different kinds of things. And I think it confused the firefighters a lot Joe was so strong and macho, and I was strong and brave and running into fires, and they couldn't quite figure out how two men could be together like that. It seemed to be one of the things that bothered them the most. But while I was putting the roof panels on our house in 1982, I was listening to the radio, and I heard a report about this new disease in the United States that seemed to be killing gay men. And in those days, it was inappropriately called GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency. Even though I wasn't a healthcare worker, I knew darn well that there wasn't a disease that would only affect gay men. Still, this burgeoning epidemic now, the AIDS epidemic, gave the firefighters a new way to harass me. A few weeks later, there was a newspaper article in the Miami News that noted that now 500 Americans had died of this new disease, AIDS. And when I walked into the firehouse for my next shift, that newspaper clipping was posted up on the bulletin board, and the guys had made a makeshift scoreboard right next to it. And it said, "AIDS 500, faggots nothing." Now, this was a step over the line for me. I had already lost 3 friends to AIDS by this time. So I went to my captain and I said, "You know, Captain, they can call me names, they can harass me, they can do what they want, but this is over the line. This is inappropriate. This is dehumanizing." And my captain's response was, "Well, these guys didn't die of cancer, did they?" So I realized I was not going to get any support from the administration. So in my memoir, I describe a lot of my motivations for continuing on in the fire department. I loved firefighting. There was a day when I saved a young boy's life. A little 8-year-old had had an accident and was not breathing, and I had to do CPR and keep him alive until the ambulance could get there. And I was eventually given the Outstanding Young Firefighter of the Year award by the JC's organization. I think that for the good guys, that made them feel good because a firefighter got acknowledged for doing something great in the city. But for my enemies, it only seemed to make them more angry and more frustrated. So in the book, I really talk about what I was going through and how I was trying to manage this, because to me, it was a matter of they didn't think I was man enough to be a firefighter, and yet I was outperforming them on a regular basis. So in 1983, I've been in the department 2 years now with this awful shift of men. The chief calls me in and says, "I'm going to move you to a different shift." And I thought, oh my God, I just got used to these men after 2 years of working with them. But it turned out the chief then changed me to the best shift in the department, not the worst, but the best. I don't know if it's because he was trying to reduce the harassment and he was afraid that potential violence was going to get out of control, or did he think I was so dedicated to the job? Well, it wasn't for quite a while after that I learned that the captain of the new shift, the man on the left here, Captain George Vidal, had actually asked for me to be transferred to his shift. So when I found that out, I said, Captain, tell me about that. Why did you ask me to be here? And he said, I want the shift with the best firefighters in the department. He said, I don't want these lazy guys who don't know what they're doing. So the captain advised me with mentorship and opportunities for leadership. And my lieutenant now was Al Raming, which was just wonderful. So despite being on this shift now of good men, the harassment still came in the form of phone calls or damage to my motorcycle or to our truck or my other personal belongings when we were at the firehouse. So they, in these years, never missed a day of with a chance to harass me. So many of the firemen in the department were related to each other. And that's true about fire departments all across the country, that firefighters are generally descendants of firefighters. Well, I was no different. In the 1940s, my mother's father was a fire chief of a town in Yorkshire, England. He was the fire chief. When bombing of London got severe, firefighters from all across the country were called down to London to help put out fires. And so my grandfather had to go down to London, and at which point my grandmother became the fire chief of the town, mainly with a fire department of men who couldn't go and women. So I came from a long line of firefighters, apparently. Now, during these years, I was also very involved in the community. With my 48 hours off, there were a lot of things that I volunteered for. So an island community really functions by its newspaper. It just lives and breathes by what's put in the newspaper. And I had quite a reputation for volunteering and fundraising. So for here, for example, I participated in a dance-a-thon, a 12-hour dance-a-thon every year to raise money for our crisis line called Helpline. I designed and built a fire truck that we placed in a playground for a child care center so the kids could climb all over it. And I completed hospice training and volunteered to provide respite and other services for people who were dying of AIDS, cancer, and life-limiting illnesses. Eventually, Joe and I finished our house on Bay Point, and life was actually beginning to feel a little bit normal. However, in 1984, some members of the Firefighters Union made a formal request to the city government to have me fired from the department. The rationale was that as a gay man, I was inherently immoral and should never have been hired in the first place. Furthermore, they asserted that all gay men would get AIDS and that I would put the other firemen at risk because we shared the same dishes, the same showers, sleeping bunks, or fire equipment. So in my book, I provide a lot of detail about that meeting, a public meeting in which I had to defend my right to be a firefighter. And still, it was another year before I even thought about leaving the fire department. Now, the day came when I decided I was going to leave the fire department, and I knew that what that last day would be. So we work until 7 in the morning, and then our shift ends. At 6 in the morning, 1 hour before I'm leaving the fire department, we get a call for a very large, dangerous fire at the El-70 Inn, which was a guest house in Old Key West. All available firefighters in the city were called, including the Navy firefighters and the firefighters in the airport, because it was such a dangerous fire. Now, I'd like to point out in this picture, do you see that telephone pole there on the left? It is catching fire because of the radiated heat coming from that house burning down, and they had to keep putting out the telephone pole so that it wouldn't burn. Now, my captain and I were right behind that car near that white fence, and our position was to sit with a single hose and keep this petroleum gas tank from exploding. The gas tank was very close to the house, and if it had exploded, if it got too hot, it would have taken out several houses in the neighborhood, and we would never have stopped that fire in Old Town Key West. But due to the incredibly high heat conditions and the fact that we were left there too long, my captain and I both ended up in the hospital. So I guess you could say that I left the department in a blaze of glory. So in my book, I describe how my sense of humor helped me to weather a lot of those ongoing assaults and harassment. I talk about the conflict, but I also talk about resilience and about triumph in the face of adversity. And what I want readers to really think about is, why do we have professions that are for men, professions that are for women? What does it mean to be masculine? I mean, what exactly is that word supposed to mean? And for firefighters, why do we call them America's bravest? I certainly worked with a whole group of them that weren't very brave at all. Now, I left the Key West Fire Department to pursue a career in nursing. And that was because, particularly with my hospice volunteering over the years, I learned that nurses were extraordinary. And I loved the science, but I liked people probably more than I liked burning buildings. So I did go off to the community college to pursue a degree in nursing, which eventually led me to becoming an AIDS expert and getting a master's and a PhD in nursing. But in my book, I don't just talk about homophobia. I talk about the racism that was in the department and how it infiltrated everything. The misogyny. There were no women in our department at all. They were all firefighters. And it wasn't until just 3 years ago they started to hire women in the department. And when I asked, wow, women firefighters, you finally got around to it. And they said, well, they run rescue, they do EMTs, they're paramedics and that. So they're really even still trying to keep the women out of fighting fires, even though it's been well proven that women are quite capable of being good firefighters. And I'll stop with just one comment. It is kind of funny that I went to nursing, because then in 1985 or 1987, by the time I got my degree, I was one of few men in a female profession, which came with a whole nother set of expectations about roles and masculinity. And there were so many similarities and so many differences, thank God, from my years in the fire department. But I never regretted being a firefighter. It was something that was wonderful for me to do, and I quite appreciated it. So I'll stop there. I would love to hear people's comments, questions, discussion.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. That was a terrific introduction and terrific discussion of your book. But talk a little more, would you, about being a man in a very gendered profession of nursing?
Well, it surprised me. When I went to nursing school, there were very few men. There were only 2 in my class. And I was probably well prepared for nursing school because I'd been a firefighter for 4 years. So I'd seen a lot of things. I was good in an emergency. Things didn't faze me quite so much. But I was surprised at how nurses who'd been in the profession for 10, 20 years immediately thought that I was more capable than they were. I'll give you an example. I'd been a registered nurse for all of 2 months, and code blue goes off. You've got to run with a crash cart because someone has stopped breathing or their heart has stopped. And so I was the one who was chosen to run with the cart down to the medical ward. And I'm coming in the room, and here are two nurses that have been nurses for many, many years. And their response was, oh, thank God Kevin's here. And they expected me to take over the code blue. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, guys, you've done this dozens of times. And frankly, I've never actually done it really. I've virtually done it. We've practiced it. But they expected that I was going to be able to do it. The things I didn't like so much about being a man in what they called a female profession was I was supposed to be the backbone. I was supposed to be the guy who lifted all the patients, who moved all the heavy patients. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we learned in nursing school how to move patients without hurting your back. And frankly, women have been doing that in the profession for decades. So what makes you think I'm going to come in 130 pounds that I was and lift up this heavy patient and move them? So it was funny what their expectations are. But I also then saw how that gets socialized. I was working in an emergency room to begin with. I started in the emergency room, and I would be amazed when women came in complaining of chest pain, that the female nurses would downplay their symptoms. Oh, she probably had an argument with her husband and just trying to catch his attention, or maybe she's a little bit anxious, so let's give her some medication. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, don't women have heart attacks? If this had been a man, we would have moved lightning fast to get an IV started, to get an EKG done, to further ask about symptoms. So even the female nurses were trained to have these misogynist points of view. And that surprised me. I didn't expect it because they were so smart and well-educated. But it also was, I became a nurse right at the very year in which it no longer became appropriate to get up and give your chair to a physician when they came in. So for a long time in the hospitals, if a nurse was sitting there charting and a physician walked up to the desk, the nurse would get up, move to a different place, and give their seat to the physician. And I thought, hell no. I've been on my feet here for 6 hours. I'm not giving up my seat to a physician. But I also learned that I could advocate a lot better. Maybe because I already had the skills in communicating clearly. Many of the female nurses were afraid to speak to the physician because they didn't want to get yelled at. And my feeling was, no physician should yell at a nurse. That's not what we're here for. We should be communicating. So I was much more direct. And when a physician tried to be sort of obnoxious, I would say, excuse me, doc, that's not the question I'm asking. What I asked you is, what dose would you like for blah, blah, blah? And they weren't used to such confrontative, straightforward questioning of their behavior. So it was interesting. Did I enjoy working with women much more? Oh, phenomenally, much more. Our conversations were much more interesting, because you work late into the night and you have long conversations about patients. The nurses were so empathetic and compassionate and thoughtful and understood culture and were much more flexible to do things. The firemen weren't like that at all. They were very binary. Yes, no, black and white. There is no gray. And who cares who people are and what their circumstances are? We're just here to fight their fire. So those are some of my initial thoughts on it. The firemen were the ones who caused me so much trouble, were very threatened by my being there. Somehow I undermined their masculinity, particularly when I performed better than they did, which I thought was ridiculous because your sexual orientation has nothing to do with this masculinity stuff. The nurses weren't like that. They were much more engaging, much more thoughtful, and asked a lot of questions. I can't say they knew anything more than the firemen knew about homosexual relationships, because in the 80s, very few people were out. But they were willing to talk about it.
We have a quote in the chat from Kay Ailey. Kay, do you want to talk about it, or do you want it read?
Can you hear me?
We
Yes,
can.
absolutely.
Well, it's just that I've rarely been in the hospital, actually. Once it was when I was having a child, and once was having my hips replaced. But I remember they were so, I was just so impressed, because I guess there aren't many, or at least I didn't know many. And they did exactly the right thing and were so empathetic and explained things to me. They sort of, it seemed to me they went out of their way. They spent more time. And I've always remembered both of them for what they did for me. So I just wanted you to know that.
Well, thank you.
And by the way, I just love I mean, this is the most enjoyable evening talk. I've
Well,
just
thank you.
enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well, I will say that when I was initially in nursing, as a nursing student, I belonged to a statewide organization of nursing students. You know, you start early getting socialized into the profession. And at a statewide conference in Florida, there was only one other man at this conference, and there were 1,200 of us, I guess, from around the state. So there were nearly 1,200 women and 2 men. And that man got up and in our general audience discussion and said he felt that gay men should not be allowed in nursing. And well, he didn't say gay men, he said homosexuals, because they weren't even nice enough to say gay men in those days. And his rationale was that we would only bring down the profession, and we were all going to get AIDS anyway. And when someone spoke up and said, well, you know, that's really not true, then his next response was, well, the reason gay men shouldn't be there is because I'm a straight man. And he says, everyone assumes I'm gay because I became a nurse. And he said, and that I find really disagreeable. So I got up to the microphone and I said, well, you know, first of all, gay men aren't immoral. You know, I've got a partner of many years here. And I said, and second of all, we won't all get AIDS. It's an infection. So some people will get it, some people will not. And I said, and I, for one, don't have it. And I said, and as for everyone thinking that you're gay because you're a nurse, really sounds more like a personal problem of yours and not of mine. And the audience of nursing students just went crazy laughing about that one. But that's the point, is it's your problem. It's not my problem. But what the truth was is, now I did AIDS care. So I have to say, yeah, though I did ER and ICU and everything else, the vast majority of male nurses that I'd known in my career were gay men or bisexual men. And then we started getting more Army and Navy corpsmen, straight men who had gotten out of the military, decided to go into nursing. So now we have a lot more straight men than we used to. But with so many gay men for so many decades, we came with the idea that we'd already been persecuted, we'd already been mistreated. People seemed to think they knew who we were and what our culture was like, and we were just people. So I think we developed a lot of compassion for the underdog, if you will. And to me, any patient in a hospital is an underdog, right? They're on the receiving end of everything, and the rest of us are in a position of authority. So I feel that a nurse's job is always to advocate for the patient, to think about what's their situation, what do they need? And women, not surprisingly, have been socialized to be a lot more empathetic and compassionate. And gay men followed a lot of that. I think one of the things that made me different is, and it's a good example talking tonight, because I was America's bravest. I was a firefighter who ran into burning buildings and saved people. And I was a nurse who was compassionate and caring through mental illness, cancer care, end of life, running grief and bereavement groups for people. So it doesn't matter whether I'm masculine or feminine. The truth is, I am who I am. And so that same concept runs across whether you're talking about race, religion, culture. People are people. And as a nurse, I was able to really maximize that. In my teaching of students, I would remind them that they may be in a room taking care of a young Jewish man who's got Crohn's disease, and walk across the hall, and now you've got an older African-American woman who has breast cancer and is having her breasts removed. And then you walk into another room and you have to change your frame of reference to appreciate and accommodate what people need at the time that they need it. And hopefully that's what all nurses do, but we know that's not true. But I love the profession. I think that nursing is really important to people. I loved firefighting, and particularly with the firefighters that were really good guys. And my book does talk quite a bit about the guys that were really good and stood up and did not harass me, and actually encouraged me and mentored me.
Mary's got a good question in the chat. You want to do it,
Okay.
Mary?
Sorry about that. Couldn't find the mute. Now, you had mentioned speaking to former coworkers in Key West for this book,
Yes.
and I wondered if there were any instances where their memories differed from yours.
Yes, perceptions were different. So in the book, I particularly highlight 3 guys whose names all start with A and AL, so it's confusing. It's Alex, Alan, and Alfred. So 2 of them I did not work with often. They just ran into me occasionally when different firehouses would meet at a fire or something like that. So, but they were good guys. They still encouraged me and mentored me. So when I went back to interview them, of course, they're all retired now. They said, you know, Kevin, we read your book and we heard you do the presentation. I did a presentation at the Firehouse Museum there. They said, we had no idea how bad the bad guys were. And I thought, how could you not know? They're your friends, they're your neighbors, they're guys you went to high school with. But I really did believe them, that because they weren't in the firehouse, they didn't see me pushed up against the wall. They didn't see me knocked off the truck. They didn't. But on the other side, they brought up a situation that where I was put in danger that I didn't know about. So I tell the story, a couple stories in my book where the men purposely tried to hurt me at a fire scene. And which is, you know, just against every rule firefighters should ever have. But they thought it was funny, and they thought it was what was going to get me out of the department if I got hurt. When I did the interviews, Alex said, well, I remember that one day when you were going into the building, and they described how the guys were putting me in danger behind me, but I couldn't see them, so I never knew it happened. And they went to one of the supervising captains and called out the guys on it, said, you know, Captain, you've got to stop this. They're going to put him in danger here. And the captain did intercede. So it all happened without me even knowing it happened. But hearing their side of it, it made them so angry that somebody would put me in danger just simply because I was a gay guy. You know, it just angered them. So that was surprising to me, that there were things that happened that I didn't know about. And that they didn't know how much was happening to me, because I assumed all of them knew that. But I probably should never have made that assumption. I did ask Alex in particular, and not to be rude to Alex, but he was a wonderful man and not the brightest light bulb in the package. You know, he's not a very well-educated man, but so nice and such a good firefighter. But anyway, when I'm interviewing them, I said, all right, I have a question for you guys. You were helping me to learn how to hold the hose, how to jump off the truck in a certain way, how to climb the ladders, and why? Your best friends were doing everything they could to get me to quit. And you were helping me. You were mentoring me. And Alex, who's not all that bright, simply said, well, Kevin, it was the right thing to do. You were a fellow firefighter and you deserved everything that we deserved. Leave it to the one guy with the least amount of education to have the clearest view of what's right and wrong, and what people deserve. So the other thing that surprised me is that the second captain that I had, the Cuban-American Captain George Vidal, who was really excellent to me, really, really good. I didn't find out, he died many years ago, but I didn't find out until I went down to do the interviews that his son was gay. And I said, oh, I don't think I ever knew that. I said, you know, who is he? And they go, well, you must know Christopher because he's your age. And I said, no, I never met him. And my captain mentioned that he had a son. He only had one child. And I said, but he never mentioned anything about his being gay. So I ended up meeting the son, who is my age. And the son says, oh, I know who you are. You're the brother my father never had for me. I said, what? And he said, so this boy, well, man, says to me, my father used to come home from the fire department and tell me, Christopher, be whatever you want to be. And he knew his son was gay. And he said, I think because my father worked with you, that he treated me with the greatest of respect. And he said, so I have confidence and I've had a great life. And I thought, wow, that was so wonderful to hear. It took me 35 years to hear that. And now 2 of my lieutenants have written me and told me that one of their children is gay, and that they get along well with them. And that to me is just worth a million. Other than that, I don't think there was a lot of surprise. Oh, one of them had never heard about the city meeting where they were trying to fire me. And that was a long drawn out meeting with a lot of drama and other kinds of things. But it was really the greatest risk to my job in 1984. And it wasn't until they read the newspaper article, they said, oh my God, we didn't know some of the other firemen were even trying to do that. So I guess what I learned is don't assume everybody knows what's going on when you're being harassed. I was very pleased that there were really good guys in the department that were great firefighters. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
Other questions or hands, comments? Yes, Richard.
Yeah. Kevin, this is an excellent presentation, and you're a delight. It's a delight to listen to your story. You're a born storyteller, I think. I am just flabbergasted at the amount of harassment, particularly the physical harassment that you endured for so long. And I'm wondering, including the threats that they wouldn't necessarily have your back in a dangerous situation. I'm just wondering if it ever occurred to them, or did it ever happen in practice, that they would be in a situation where they would need you to have their backs. I don't know that would have impressed them, but I'm just curious.
Well, there were times in which I did have their back, because I don't want to make myself sound great. There were a group of us in the department who loved what we did. And so when the time came to run in and do something, we did it. Some of these other guys that were harassing me did not do that. So I would arrive at a scene sometimes and they were already in a building or in some situation. We had a plane crash in the island and things like that. And and they were lost. They didn't know what to do because they hadn't had good training, and they didn't really care much about their job. They just wanted to go to work and get benefits. And so in a sense, I did sort of rescue them by coming in and taking charge and saying, do this, do this, do this, take that over there, you know, grab such and such. Even though I wasn't in charge with them, we were all at really the same level, but they didn't know what to do. So in a sense, I did sort of have their back. But that was my point. My point about, like, they would yell in my face, you know, goddamn faggot. And I would just be very flat-faced, not respond back, not yell, scream, or do anything else. And they didn't know what to do with that. And it was my way of saying, you know, I'm not going to play this game. This is a ridiculous game. Like they would make comments about my masculinity, and I'd say things like, I don't know, my partner doesn't seem to have any trouble with my masculinity. And they wouldn't know what to do with that. They asked me at one point, this one obnoxious man over coffee one day says, well, we have a question for you, Mallinson. And I said, what? Are you the guy or the girl? And so I cocked my head to the side and I said, what? And he says, are you the guy or the girl? And I said, what are you talking about? And I knew darn well what they were getting at. But he says, well, when you're, you know, like together with Joe, are you like the guy or the girl? And I looked at him and I said, you mean I have to choose? And he looks at me and he goes, well, of course you have to choose. And I looked up and I thought, oh my God, nobody ever told me I had to choose. I said, I'll have to think about that. I'll get back to you on it. And I walked out of the room. And it was a way of saying to them, what a stupid question, without saying to them it's a stupid question. But I describe a number of those things that I did in the book like that, because I didn't want to disrespect them, but I was in fear for my life. And so shortly before I left the department, I wrote a letter to the city manager and to the mayor and to my sister and said, I have been threatened, and should anything happen to me, and to my sister in particular, sue the city for every penny it's got, because they have done nothing about it. And that got a response. That got the chief coming right to me and apologizing and saying, you know, I hope it hasn't been so bad. And, you know, I wanted him to grovel a little bit because he was responsible for a bunch of that.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It's been
Absolutely.
a really wonderful evening, wonderful stories, and we're delighted that you survived it all, became a nurse, went to Africa, all of those wonderful things. So thank you so much. And to everybody, see you in September.
Thank you all for your time and attention. Thanks so much, Trudy. Thanks, Mary. Bye-bye.